excited today. Very, very excited today. We have Maurice Switzer with us today. An amazing man I met several months ago at our Halton Catholic District School Board. Does a lot of great work, is the director of NIMKI Communications. And we're going to spend about 90 minutes with him today and learn about some really important relationships that I think are important for our future coming faces and everyone around. So Maurice, please take a few minutes to introduce yourself and welcome.
Thanks very much, Jody, and I'm very appreciative, always appreciative of the opportunity to share some of the things that I have learned and continue to learn, and a lot of things that most Canadians, including myself, haven't. People who live in Canada haven't learned because they haven't been taught in our schools until pretty recently. And I tell teachers that the things that they're starting to learn, some of them very positive aspects of Canada's history, some of them not so positive, but they're all important. And the generation of students right now in schools are the first Canadians to learn about many of these things. So really, the session today is primarily it's our audience are going to be adults, again, people who haven't learned about these things. So it's always a privilege for me. I'm speaking to you this morning from a territory up here on the shores of Lake Nipissing. I'm living in North Bay for the last 20 years. My home territory is, and my family's territory is in southern Ontario, the Mississaugas of Alderville First Nation, where my grandfather Moses Muskrat Marsden was the chief in the early part of the 20th century for a number of years. And our closest First Nation here are the Ojibwe of Nipissing First Nation. And but this is all Anishinaabe territory. Most of Ontario is Anishinaabe territory. So I'm really privileged to be here and thank Jody for all her support in making this happen. The technology is wonderful. In these times of COVID, it's amazing that technology can help bring us together. And I'm used to, at this time of year, being asked to come to places like Milton or different places, Oakville, and talk to groups of students and teachers. Usually the groups are 30, maybe not much more. And I imagine, I'm hoping that right now we have a few more people than that. And as this is going to be recorded and rebroadcast in different ways, that there will be many more people that hear some of the messages than normally do. I was speaking last Thursday to a broadcast, a webinar that was staged by the provincial government through their Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, and there were 800 people, civil servants, 800 that were tuned in. And that's, again, I'd much rather speak to people face to face, but it's not a bad plan B, to be able to share information with more people, and we hope that we're going to leave time when I'm done to field any questions, and I'll ask Jody to sort of be the moderator and select questions that she thinks maybe it'd be helpful if I answer. So I encourage you, to do that. Just before I introduce myself in some of the words of the language that I know, I just want to emphasize to people, as I usually do, I don't want anybody to feel in any way inferior or bad or guilty, because and a lot of teachers I've met, I know, are very awkward about teaching First Nations, Métis, and Inuit studies, or the different titles they give courses impacting on Indigenous issues. I don't want anybody to feel bad because you don't know as much as you'd like to know about 95% of what I'm going to share with you today, perhaps more, I didn't know when I started on this journey about 25 years ago. I've had to learn, because I went to the same schools that most of you did, and we didn't know what residential schools were. I didn't know until I was an adult that my grandfather had gone to in Alderville what they used to call an industrial training school, which was one of the forerunners of the residential school program. He ran away. He never talked about it with family. We've had to do what we can in hindsight, trying to find out details. He ran away when he was 8 years old, had to teach himself how to read and write. And we certainly didn't know about treaties. What I try to do in the work that I do that advocates on behalf of largely urban Indigenous people these days is to hope that what I tell you, I don't want people to accept what I tell them as if it's gospel truth. I hope it provokes your curiosity and makes you want to learn more. I learn more every single day about the things that I'm talking about, and I've been lucky that there have been some people who've dedicated their lives to research. I know one of my a person whose information and research I value a great deal is a man named Alan Corbiere from Chiging First Nation on Manitoulin Island, who's just been appointed this year an associate professor at York University. But Alan is one of those people, as is Dr. John Borrows, who is now, I think, at the University of Victoria. They've dedicated their lives, their adult lives, to finding, unearthing information that, for one reason or another, hasn't been part of Canada's official history. And it's good that these things are happening. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll start. I've been asked if I would, I'll introduce myself in the language Anishinaabe, and I'll tell you afterwards what I said, and then I've been asked if I kind of officially open the week, and I usually open my days and let alone my weeks with a Thanksgiving. Every day is Thanksgiving if you're Indigenous, not just one day a year with turkey. So Ani Bojo, Bnesi Dijnakas, Wejesh Dodam Anashnabek, Mangan Dodam Hodinashoni, Alderville Donjiba, North Bay and Dayan Anashnabek and Dow. So I've said that a name I've been given is Bnesi, which is a type of bird. I said that I have two clans. My grandfather Moses Marsden, Muskrat Marsden, and his wife Ormanelli Franklin were living in Alderville, which is near Cobourg, Ontario, and were married for 63 years. And from my grandfather, I have a Muskrat clan. That was actually his name. The last name Marsden, like so many names of First Nations people, was imposed on people that lived in his community by missionaries. And actually is a name, I think, of a Methodist bishop somewhere in England. Even the name of the community where I have roots, Alderville. Alder is the name of another Methodist person, and I'm glad to see that many First Nations around the province and the country are reverting to traditional names, and I'm hoping that my home community will soon follow suit. And my grandmother's side, her mother was a woman named Esther Hill from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. So I'm very proud of that part of my heritage as well. My father, Harold Switzer, was a Jewish cab driver in Toronto. So I've met a few people that have that heritage. Down from your neck of the woods, the great musician and now author Robbie Robertson has similar roots, as do the famous acting Podemsky sisters. And while those two cultures, the Jewish culture and Indigenous cultures, have had more than their share of strife over the centuries, it really, I've come to realize how much that helps me have a personal sense of responsibility to support human rights and minority rights. And I said that, so I have the Muskrat clan through my grandfather. I have the Wolf clan through the hills of Tyendinaga. I said that my family roots origin are in Alderville First Nation. And I said that I'm living in North Bay, where I've lived for 20 years this month. Beautiful shores of Lake Nipissing. We just had a little dusting of snow last night. The first time we've had any snow that lingered at all. It's still on my hedge as I look at it right now this morning. And I said that we're part of the Anishinaabe Nation. And on a flagpole on the front of my house on the shore of Lake Nipissing flies an Anishinaabe Nation flag very proudly. This is our territory. One of my pet local projects is to try to convince the municipality of North Bay we fly here flags in different parks that commemorate, celebrate the presence of Italians, of Franco-Ontarians, of armed forces, of Great Britain, but except for one day a year on what's been designated June 21st as National Indigenous Peoples Day, we don't celebrate officially this municipality the presence of Indigenous peoples. So I fly my flag 365 days a year because this has been and always will be Anishinaabe territory. And we're trying to encourage our municipality to make that similar recognition and observance. So I was asked if I would do a little opening, and I'll do that now in the language. And before I do, I'll tell you that it's basically an expression of gratitude for everything that we have when we open our eyes every morning, for the plants, the animals, the fish. The air that we breathe, the water that we drink. So I'll do that now before I start my presentation. Miigwech Mishamsnanik, Miigwech Nakomasnanik, Miigwech Takamikwe, Gimijgung, Shkiki Gimijung Tikog, Gimijung Wasinia, Gimijung Benesia, Gimijung Gagonyag, Gimijung Sinin, Gimijung Aki, Gimijung Nodin, Gimijung Shkoda, Gimijung Nabi, Gimijung Mijaminwa, Gimijung Mods Win. Saman agap kidnan angu wednung, wabnung jaunung, minagabiaunung, miigwech. So I'm wishing everybody a good health today and every day, and in very challenging times. And I'm hoping that the information I'm going to be sharing with you, as I say, makes you curious about learning more, and maybe answers some questions that you've had. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Maurice. It's lovely when someone shares an opening that does remind you. It's through grandmother's voice and through my healing journey, my connection to my family. I've been shown that way to wake up every day and be grateful for Mother Earth and these opportunities to speak and to live on, in the territories of actually Mississaugas of the Credit. They actually, a group of gentlemen in the neighborhood and in the area, and some groups of our community members actually had a flag raised at our Oakville Town Hall last year. It was wonderful to see just even some acknowledgement. So we're doing some great work here in Halton. Very grateful to all of our community partners. Oakville Public Library today, thank you so much for sponsoring and always supporting the work that Grandmother's Voice has been doing for the last, over the last 4 years and more, actually. Just building capacity and relationships with different groups all over Southern Ontario and even coast to coast. When the work has to be done, people come. and especially if the work is done in a good way. So with much appreciation for your opening and your words, I'd also like to acknowledge my own grandmother, great-grandmother, my father, all of Indigenous descent, my great-grandmother from the Cayuga Nation of the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, also known as Haudenosaunee Confederacy and Iroquois Nation. My father was also, that was part of the 60 scoop, what I'm learning. So we do not know of his father's Indigenous heritage because of that whole situation. But every day I have that belief and that understanding and knowing that this is the work that I'm supposed to be doing, and really honored every time that I get to meet someone that's about to share information that could change the listener's life. And so I just want to, before you get going, I just like to plant a couple of seeds. Thank also Moses Lunam for the background of this amazing Speak Up and Empower. This is, excuse me, going to be one of our paint nights in our Halton community and our Halton Learning Lodge, which is also another initiative that we've created in the Halton area. So watch for that opportunity. It's going to be a paint night through our school boards. And so, you know, I really looked forward to this, Morris, because you know, when I did my own research, realizing that like 85%, if not more, I don't know, I'm just throwing Jody numbers out, of Indigenous people are urban, live in urban communities. These conversations of treaties become so important. And so just before you get going, I'd just like people to keep in mind this in the back seat of their, you know, thinking when you're sharing this information, because I've seen your presentations and they're amazing and they're detailed and they're in a way that allows people to learn in a gracious way. And so, you know, the treaties that he's going to speak about, I think it's important to realize that the treaties are relationships. And so keeping in mind that the TRC and the, you know, the calls for action and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls for justice and the urban Indigenous action plans, like these are just name a few, these treaties and relationship building responsibilities of all Canadians. And so, you know, with much appreciation for you to be here, Maurice, I'd like to share your, I'll share your screen now and would like to give this time for you to share your teachings.
I start virtually every presentation I do on any topic with this teaching, and this is the first Indigenous teaching I was ever given many years ago by a man named Jim Dumont, who was well known among Anishinaabeg circles. He's a Medewan Lodge teacher, and I'm not Medewan, but they have offered and still provide many really valuable teachings. And this very simply. This teaching says, and again, these teachings are, people can spend days going through all the details, but just the very brief version is that the first person that was going to come to this earth was in a circular lodge, and the Creator was giving him or her, whoever you want it to be, instructions about what, and giving them gifts they would need to come to this place. And the Creator turned that person to the east and showed him a braid of sweetgrass, and that was to signify respect for all living things. And when he faced the south, he saw a tree, and that was the way a tree grows up straight and tall, symbolizes honesty. And in the west, he saw the image of a deer, and a deer is just one example of sharing. And you know, we're taught that that creatures are given original instructions so that some of them are prepared to give up their lives so that others, you know, can live as food. It's also sharing. The ultimate example of sharing are the warriors who have protected their peoples, and that's the ultimate act of sharing, being prepared to give up your own life. And that's why at our powwows, the first people that come in are usually the warriors, the veterans. And in the north, he showed him a stone. This is a big stone, a mountain, and taught that that basically that's something that can last for a long time, forever, without appearing to be changed in any significant way. And that's a metaphor for strength, and not physical strength, but endurance and perseverance. So again, this teaching has many depths, and when we talk about treaties today, you can ask yourselves what you know about treaties, what's happening in Canada today, for example, on the east coast, in the lobster fishery, and closer to you at 1492 Landback Lane near Caledonia. Are the authorities and the representatives of the Crown, are they demonstrating respect to their treaty partners? Are they honest and truthful in their dealings with us? Have they shared in the way that they promised that they were going to? And I think that the people who are fighting to have our treaty rights recognized, most Canadians, non-Indigenous peoples, have been enjoying their treaty rights for many years, but it's the First Peoples who are here that are having a challenge is getting our treaty rights recognized, and that's shown a lot of persistence and strength. And we are fighting to have promises kept that were made 2.5 centuries ago, and that takes a lot of strength. So I want to start with that teaching, and again, what we're talking about today are treaties and the treaty relationship. One of the great myths about treaties is that somehow Indigenous peoples were just wandering around aimlessly in the Americas, and these Europeans came and they taught us all these innovations like treaties. Our ancestors were making treaty agreements with one another thousands of years before that. They had to share the land without fences. You had to have agreements and treaties to know where your territories were. The dictionary definition usually talks about treaties as an agreement, usually in terms of a legal agreement. It can be agreements between not just two parties, but a multitude of parties. Most treaties in Canada involve provincial governments as well as federal governments, or pre-Confederation governments. They were kind of hybrids when you had places like Upper and Lower Canada, and before there was formally a Canada in as recently as 1867. And there are modern treaties. Here's an example of one of the many modern treaties that Canada is a party to. It used to be called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. You can see that fellow in the middle looks like he's cheating on an exam by looking over the shoulder of someone who sits at a desk next to him. I hope he's not checking how to spell his own name. That's a distinct possibility. But this is one of many agreements, and unfortunately, it's not just treaties with Indians, and I'm going to use that word Indians today a number of times in a historic sense, because we still have an Indian Act. I worked for an organization for some years called the Union of Ontario Indians. That term is still used by many people to describe the First Peoples of North America. So we, unfortunately, while treaties to us have been violated almost unanimously, we have people, including that gentleman in the middle of this bottom row of this photograph, who make a habit of breaking agreements and treaties. And this one is one that he broke, and they had to renegotiate the terms because he wasn't happy with the terms as they turned out for his one of three parties to the agreement. And Indigenous peoples, First Nations, we'd be delighted if Canada just started observing, the first terms, let alone, rewriting We haven't asked anybody to rewrite the terms of our treaties. We just have asked that the original terms be honored. Canada is a party to treaties on, for example, the Paris Accord was about climate control and promises to do things, to improve the world's climate. There are nuclear disarmament treaties. The European Common Market is a treaty. So it's not the thing to remember is that when a nation, and it's nations that make treaties, when nations make treaties, their reputation is at stake if they don't keep the pledges that they made. To lose your reputation, which is unfortunately what's happened internationally with our treaty, with this treaty partner in the center of this image. When a nation loses its international reputation, it's a sad thing to see. It's pathetic. Indian treaties. This is a typical image of the negotiation of an Indian treaty, likely out on the prairies. The people with the pith helmets would be the Northwest Mounted Police, and there are probably across Canada some 70 treaties. In Ontario alone, about I think 46 is the number that most people agree with. The treaties, when they started, you have to remember, even as you can see in this photograph, that perhaps the reason that the relationship started off very positively is that the newcomers that came here were greatly outnumbered and tended to be a lot more humble in dealing with the first peoples that they encountered. It was only after that population balance shifted dramatically in the 1800s that the idea of keeping treaty promises fell out of favor. We have to know. When I talk to students, I say when people came here from other parts of the world, and we talk now about refugees as if they only came from places like Syria, but everybody who came to Canada were refugees. Some of them were religious refugees. Remember, in the 1500s, you weren't allowed to even say such heresies in Europe as the earth goes around the sun, and there were many people who suffered because of their religious beliefs. There was no freedom of religion. Most people, unless you were born into the nobility, you never owned your own land. You spent your life as a slave. They had a polite word for it. They called them serfs. So you would be the most likely candidate to end up being a soldier, which gave you a very high chance of not surviving. The way they used to fight their battles, it was just throwing people into a field against one another, almost certain death for most of them. So most people who accepted the opportunity to travel on these voyages, dangerous voyages across the ocean to start a new life, most of them, we would call them refugees today. And when they came here, if they came in peace, Indigenous peoples in North America and tended to welcome them and show them how to survive and show them how to travel. They would show them how they made canoes. They would show them how to make lodges, maybe temporary lodges like out of like wigwams or teepees, or perhaps out of wood, to show them where the foods were and how to harvest them, to show them the medicines that they used when they were sick. And here's this slide shows First Nations people showing newcomers how to extract sap from trees and use it to make sweetener for their food, maple sugar in this case. The only time when people came here in warfare, probably around 1000 AD, when the Vikings landed on the shores of what's now Newfoundland or Labrador, they weren't welcomed in a friendly way if they came in war. And actually, that's one of the few places where the warlike Vikings came that they were scooted home and retreated, because these little indigenous peoples that the Vikings called Skraelings, they were probably Inuit or Innu people, terrified them in battle. Indigenous peoples have always fiercely protected their lands. This is from a book that I helped to create for a local school board, in which when we talk about treaties to particularly the smallest, the youngest students, we say a treaty is just a fancy word for a promise. And again, we see the image of this elderly eagle is explaining to his granddaughter about when the human beings came from other parts of the world, and they came up on the shores of North America, and they were welcomed almost always in a friendly way by the First Nations people. Treaties came into being after maybe a century or so of relatively peaceful coexistence in what we call Canada. And one of the differences you can note here is you can see the colonist treaty makers with a whole bunch of paper in front of them, and on the left you can see and this is probably a United States image. You can see an Indian leader holding what's a wampum belt, and we're going to talk a little bit later about wampum belts. They're basically beaded, woven out of beads, documents that tell a story and make the promises, and were used by Indigenous peoples primarily towards the east of the continent. Now, when people started coming here from Europe, they came guided and supported and endorsed by a very strange philosophy. Some people would call it a racist philosophy. And at that time, the crowned heads of Europe, places like England and France and Italy and Spain and Portugal, France, these were the countries where they really started exploring in earnest, the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, and primarily because they were running out of land. What land they had was basically owned by wealthy people, as we said earlier, and almost all of commoners lived as virtual slaves, and so they were running out of land, and they were always looking for resources. And we hear these stories about the Europeans venturing as far afield as China and India, and looking for wealth to finance their armies, because they were always fighting each other, and to bring more wealth into the hands of the people who were already wealthy. So they worked very carefully, the crown heads of Europe, with the church. It was almost, they wanted something, they wanted a power, a religious power, to give their actions moral value and a moral support. So and there was a lot of collaboration with the church, and primarily the Roman Catholic Church was the most powerful formal religion in Europe. And so working with the church, the first pope to do this was Pope Nicholas V in about 1452. He issued the first in a series of what they called papal bulls, decrees, proclamations, and it was called the Doctrine of Discovery. And basically, what that doctrine said was, on behalf of and to the crowned heads of these European nations, if you travel anywhere in the world and you come to lands that are populated by people who don't believe what you believe, what we believe, what the Pope believed, in generally Christianity, in particular Roman Catholicism, they were told, this decree said, that they could treat that land as if it was empty, because it was virtually, in their minds, only occupied by pagans or savages or unbelievers. And that was called the terra nullius theory, and that in Latin means empty land. And that was probably the most racist international theory that was ever devised and distributed and acted on. It's never been rescinded. When Justin Trudeau was first Prime Minister of Canada, he had an audience with Pope Francis and asked if the church would rescind that, and it's never been. There have been church comments that, oh, we're sorry if bad things happened because of this, which they inevitably did. But it's the basis of colonialism, and one wonders if the reason why there's a resistance to just, I mean, after all, in 2020, to be saying that if your land contains people who aren't Christian, then it's not really a land at all. You're not really people. You're not civilized. That could still be on the books makes one wonder that many of the world's countries like Canada concerned that if that somehow were removed as the underpinning for colonization, if somehow the government would not have any foundation, however wrong, at least any foundation. So the empty land theory, this is what North America looked like for thousands of years. You can see it's not empty. You can see that there probably isn't one square centimeter that isn't occupied by one of hundreds of nations of Indigenous peoples, from the Inuit in the north, to the Mayans and the Aztecs, in the down into Central America. And South America was, of course, much the same. So this is not empty land. Those people have been there since time immemorial. I know some people, the theory has been in schools and education for years that Indigenous people started in basically Siberia and waited until there was an ice bridge across the Bering Sea and then traipsed across into the Americas. That theory has been disproven in so many ways and in so many times that they have now found evidence that the DNA of people on this side of the Bering Strait is unique. So that's scientific evidence that those old theories are just not valid, never were. They tend to linger, but they're just not valid. So when the people came from Europe, the French were the first in what we call Canada to make inroads. Jacques Cartier came up the St. Lawrence in 1534, I think, his first voyage. And the French came into Ontario with Champlain, I think about 1608 they celebrate. And they had pretty good relationships with the First Peoples, and they were respectful to them. They provided with what we tend to call presents or gifts. They weren't. It was really no more a present or a gift than paying duty if you travel to a foreign country. It's almost like a toll or a tariff to visit their land, to come into their territories. But they were greeted respectfully at feasts and learning one another's languages. But as time evolved, the relationships turned into business relationships with fur trades, and that started a whole new industry in Europe with beaver hats and coats. And but as the Europeans came here, well, of course, they brought their quarrels with them, and it wasn't long before the British and French, who had been fighting for centuries in Europe, started fighting, in Canada about the land and about the fur trade, and by this time, of course, Britain had also started colonies south of us on the seaboard of what's now the United States. And they were the most powerful European empire that probably ever existed. They had a fleet of hundreds of ships. There wasn't any continent in the world that didn't have British colonies. But as mighty as the British were, even after they had defeated the French in North America and in Europe, they had a healthy respect for the fierceness with which Indigenous peoples defended their territories. They weren't going to come in here as they had in other parts of the world and just by sheer military force take over. So the man who took this message back to then the head of that mighty empire, the King of England, King George III, convinced, along with his economic and military and political advisors, convinced him that they had to practice diplomacy if they hoped to start settlement in a comprehensive way in this part of the world. So on the first step was a declaration on October the 7th, 1763, in which King George III, on all his advisors' recommendation, issued what is still known as the Royal Proclamation, and it still carries legal weight in serious discussions about Crown and Indigenous rights and responsibilities toward one another. And basically, that proclamation had two main principles. One was, in its words, the Indian tribes of North America are nations. They're nations of people. In the same way as that France was a nation, or Spain was a nation, or England was a nation, the Indian tribes of North America are nations. The second key piece was that they have title to their lands on which they live and which they've lived on since time immemorial. Those are two extremely important principles, again, that makes the Royal Proclamation have a great significance still to this day. Now, again, that was proclaimed in England. They didn't have, I tell the students, you have to remember, they didn't have email in those days. So how would word of that proclamation, which was pretty well unilateral, how would that get out that the king and his forces would start making this diplomacy with North Americans? Well, they sent runners all around the interior of what was then Canada, around the Great Lakes, to ask if these leaders of these nations would come to a big conference that was scheduled for the following summer in near Niagara Falls. So that gathering was regarded as, and it might still be, the largest gathering of Indian chiefs ever assembled on this continent. And this is the cover of a book that you may have seen, a little graphic novel. I'm proud to say that about 15,000 copies of that little book have been printed and distributed to schools all across the province and beyond. And the artwork was done by a citizen of Doquis First Nation, Charles Hebert, and I did the text. And it's we say it's for children of all ages, because there are university professors who don't know any more about treaties or the history of them or the current import of them than elementary school students. And as I said earlier, because most people until this generation of students did not learn these things in school, we thought it had to be kind of basic to get them into the subject. So this gathering took place. We took some artistic license. It didn't take place at Niagara Falls. It took place upriver at, I should say downriver, at Fort Niagara. And Sir William Johnson, the King's emissary, he was an extremely high-profile civil servant. He was the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for British North America, which meant almost all of the continent, which was in the United States, what was going to be the United States as well. And we gave him yellow hair. He almost certainly didn't have yellow hair, but we wanted him to stand out in this image. He would have had a powdered gray wig. And you can see he's handing something to one of the representatives of those leaders. Again, instead of one big gathering, they didn't have big screen television either in those days, or microphones. There were a series for the month of July of 1764. There were a number of council fire meetings with different chiefs of different areas. And at those meetings, Sir William Johnson talked about the Royal Proclamation. He gave wampum belts, which he had learned through his wife, Molly Brandt, And you people from the Brantford area and in Southwest Ontario know about the Brant family and Joseph Brant. And she was the consort of Sir William Johnson. They lived at his estate in Upper New York State, and she had taught him how important these wampum belts were. They told stories, and the promises were woven into them, not paper, but beads from the quag shell that's only found off the east shores of not far from actually where the Mi'kmaq are trying to fish for lobster right now. And when he gave these belts, he made promises on behalf of that mighty British Empire, on behalf of the crown, and those promises are still alive today. There have been court rulings that say that the promises made by the crown are inherited by subsequent crowns, in right of Canada. And he said, "Your people, if you take up this belt with the English, we will forever be your allies, and your people will never be poor as long as the world exists." And these promises that he made were to symbolize a relationship that was supposed to last as long as the grass grows, as long as the rivers run, and as long as the sun rises in the east. He also added, as long as the British wear red coats, and they still do. Significant, and to walk the talk instead of just words, as words don't mean very much, as we're learning. He gave, and again, they called them presents or gifts, but he gave to these leaders an estimated 13,000 gifts of everything like guns and metal objects like pots and pans and woven blankets, perhaps like that Hudson Bay blanket you can see in the foreground. And he also gave for these leaders to take back, and there were as many, they estimate, as 3,000 of them it was supposed to be 24 nations who were invited, but there actually were more. They said, all the way from James Bay, some from even Mi'kmaq territory, south of the Great Lakes, the Shawnee people, the Fox people, the Menominee people, the Haudenosaunee people, the Nipissings, they came all around. The word had got out. So these gifts they would take back to their communities, and his diary records that he gave them 6,000 pounds sterling in money. Now, 6,000 pounds in 1764 had the buying power that $20 million has today. This is a significant event. This is arguably the most significant event in Canadian history. Now, the question I have for you people who are listening, I always challenge people to ask themselves this question: why was this not in our history books? You can go on. Why were residential schools not in our history books? Why were treaties not in our history books? This is a seminal event in the history of Canada. All we hear about is the events of 100 years later, when in places like Charlottetown and Quebec City, these Englishmen got together and said, "Okay, we're going to have a country called Canada," and they all drank their champagne and ate their little three-cornered sandwiches. And that never would have been possible without the agreement of these nations of Indigenous peoples to share their land. That's all that the crown, the mighty empire, all they wanted was an agreement to share the lands that they had enjoyed exclusively. They promised in return that they would always have the rights to continue their lifestyle, to fish and hunt as they always had. You will see in a few minutes when we talk about more specific treaties that there were other elements that were added in to convince the Indigenous peoples that treaties would have value for them and for their future generations. But this is a seminal event. The Treaty of Niagara, 1764, arguably the beginning, the true beginning of what we know as Canada today. So treaties started to become a way of life for the settlers, and you can see that virtually the whole country is covered by treaties, and they last forever. Treaties don't expire, so the reason that we're still seeing treaty discussions in courts, unfortunately, we have to take governments to court to get them to honor the promises they made when they asked us to make treaties with them. And that image up in the left-hand corner is an image of the what they called the Covenant Chain Wampum Belt, one of two main wampum belts that was given by Sir William Johnson to the leaders of those nations at Niagara in 1764. And you can see the date is on the belt. I have an identical size version of that belt. It's about 6 feet long and about a foot and a half wide. They have 10,076 beads in it. Each of those beads, they said, without metal implements, would take an Indian woman as long as 2 days to complete. 2 days. They would have to chip a chunk. They had to be identical sized beads to weave them on a loom. So they had to chip these chunks out of the shell. They had to polish them, and they had to drill a hole less than about a millimeter wide. Nobody's sure how they did that without metal implements, but they did it. And you can see the two figures in the middle. Remember that image of shaking hands, which is still a universal symbol for friendship, for alliance, for sharing. There's a slight difference in the position of the heart. One of those, because it's similar to images in other wampum belts, we suspect that the figure on the right is supposed to be the indigenous person shaking hands with the settler, the colonizer, today we would say the crown. And those other images in there linking everybody together are links of a chain, a covenant chain of friendship. And that came to be regarded as a chain made out of silver, and the metaphor being that you had to renew that relationship, usually on an annual basis, to remind one another of the promises that had been made, to polish that silver chain of friendship. Now, unfortunately, and we'll talk a little bit about the War of 1812, but when, as I said, Indigenous peoples far outnumbered the Europeans, the relationship was pretty good. They had annual meetings about the treaties. There would be great givings of what they called presents, but again, you could say it was rent, and reminding one another of the promises. After the War of 1812, they're probably, when you look at that image that we showed of the Treaty of Niagara with about 3,000 Indian chiefs, that was probably more European people, just those chiefs. It was probably more than all of the Europeans in what we now call Ontario. After the War of 1812, when Canada was deemed to be safer possibly for settlers, boatloads started coming over, and gradually the treaties process sped up. The First Nations people had been weakened by their part in that war, by disease. Hundreds of thousands of Indians died because of things like smallpox. They had no immunity. And the treaties recognized the weakening, and they became, instead of agreements between equals, they were tools by colonial governments to get the land away from the Indians. And there were still promises made, and there were still some tangible things given, but they weren't done in the same spirit as the relationship had started. So you can see the dates as Canadian settlement progressed across the country. They were starting to build a railway from coast to coast after Confederation, under Sir John A. Macdonald. You can see how rapidly those treaties came into being, and all the way there were, by the time of Confederation, British Columbia still has some areas that aren't under treaty. but you can see the impact that those treaties had. And again, it was many cases the Indians were told, if you don't take what we're offering you in this treaty, we're not giving you any. We can't afford to give you any rations, any food that we're promised you. Better take it now, or you're not going to get anything. And again, because settlers used to like to write everything down, researchers can find a lot of these things, and today write books about how Canada's first leader, John A. Macdonald, was one who actually advised people in the Indian Affairs Department just withhold the food from the Indians, and we'll get their land. And again, Ontario, there isn't 1 square centimeter of land in Ontario that isn't under treaty, and this doesn't by any means show all of them. If you could zoom into Ontario, for example, there are many treaties. They came to actually call them, the colonizers came to call them surrenders. They started using words like that, and you have to remember that most of the Indian people who were involved in these treaties at this time couldn't read or write English. They trusted what they were being told by interpreters, what the content of these agreements were, and they found out subsequently that not only had they been lied to, but in some cases things had been added into the written agreement long after the actual treaty. And that's why, again, unfortunately for Canada, so many of these agreements end up in the courts. Interestingly, treaty medals were often given historically to chiefs who were involved in treaty agreements. I tell people I've never seen an Indian chief with such a great six-pack as the chief in the medal, but I'm sure they're out there. He's shaking hands, again, that handshake, that recurrent image of friendship, peace, and sharing, and with the treaty commissioner. And that image in the left on the back of the medal is the sun, because the promises were to last as long as the sun shines. On the reverse of the medals would be an image of the reigning monarch, the crown. In this case, it would be Queen Victoria. 1876, this was Treaty 6 in present-day Saskatchewan. Among the promises that were made were that the Indians would always be provided with a medicine chest. In today's language, and the Supreme Court of Canada has said that treaties must be interpreted in the way that the Indians would have understood them at the time. Medicine chest is healthcare. They were also promised they would always have a schoolhouse. That's education. And unfortunately, Canada has gradually diminished these treaty pledges by deciding that they are going to be the ones that interpret what they meant. So when they say instead of education, they decide that each First Nation, of which there are 600 in Canada, based on their population, they're going to give them so many dollars a year to cover the cost of sending a few First Nations kids to university. One of the myths, on campuses is that all First Nation kids get free education, which is just not a fact. Even though they were promised, it's not a fact. So, and we even have situations where I know up here in North Bay, the largest public school board gets about between $2 and $3 million a year in tuition agreements, so First Nation kids can attend board schools, even though it is their treaty right to have their education paid for. So they're being double charged. Despite all of this skullduggery, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, Sir Francis Bond Head, observed that an Indian's word, when formally pledged, is one of the strongest moral securities on earth. I never heard a First Nations leader say the same thing about a premier or prime minister's word, unfortunately. And then again, when we talk about those treaties, this one involves my First Nation, Alderville. When they moved from original location in the Bay of Quinte near near Belleville. They moved to their present site west towards Cobourg. And this is the language of the treaty. And again, you'll see the word surrender in there, which they never would have understood. And you can see their names written below. And you can see opposite their name, beside their name, the word totem. I told you that my totem was muskrat in Mississauga, and in wolf in Mohawk, in Ganyegahaga, and that's my family connection. Well, that's how I never say that First Nations sign treaties, because you can only sign something if you understand it in your language and can write the same language. So what they did was they would draw their clan symbol: a hoofed animal, a deer, a moose, an elk, a caribou. It could be there's one bird there. One at the bottom, James Indian. It looks like that's sort of like how I draw my muskrat symbol, my clan. So in some cases, in some treaties, they just put X. And beside their so-called signatures, it's where it says seal. They would stamp a big blob of red wax to make it look official. But this shows, as much as anything, that the lack of effective explanation or understanding of what actually the agreements meant. And for example, my grandfather Moses was the chief at Alderville. Alderville was one of the 7 First Nations that in 1923 agreed to accept some payment and benefits and reserve land in exchange for the Williams Treaty. They found out afterwards, my grandfather was in the room, and he said that all the Indians wanted to know was, would they still be able to hunt and fish the way they always had? That's how they fed their families. The government interpretation and wording made it illegal for the next 95 years for the members of those 7 First Nations to hunt and fish on their traditional territories. That was resolved 95 years later, and the government of Canada apologized for misleading, duplicitous dealings, but they had to be taken to court, and they ended up being given what looks like a massive settlement for those 7 communities. But when you break it down, it amounts to $85 an acre for all of the land that was lost, and that land in central Ontario, south central Ontario, now sells for an average of $14,000 or $15,000 an acre. So when Canada does get around to doing the right thing, there's an old saying: "Justice delayed is justice denied." And many of those hundreds and hundreds of citizens of those 7 First Nations were persecuted and prosecuted for hunting, quote, out of season, unquote, the same way as the lobster fishers, the Mi'kmaq lobster fishers, are being accused of hunting or of fishing, quote, out of season, unquote, when they had a treaty right going back over 250 years that recognized their right to basically feed themselves. I mentioned wampum belts. There are many, primarily in the eastern part of the country, that are regarded as sacred objects that recognize treaties. They're much more permanent than pieces of paper. You can see in the center the 2 belts that were at Niagara, the Covenant Chain belt, and to its left is the 24 Nations belt, which was to promise to all of the nations that were there that they would, all they had to do was pull a chain that bound them together, and the English would send them anything they wanted in their boat. Another aspect of the treaty relationship is, again, it's usually explained in terms of it being a legal transaction, but for the First Nations people, it was a sacred transaction. And they have ceremonies for all important events, including treaties, and that involved sharing the pipe. And many Indigenous peoples, including the Anishinaabe, are taught that tobacco was a sacred plant given to us by the Creator, the first plant, and it's used to pray. And we're taught that when we smoke a pipe with someone and we've made promises with them, our prayers and promises go up to the Creator in that smoke. It's as if it's sort of the Indigenous equivalent of going into a court and putting your hand on the Bible and swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So that aspect of treaty making is often overlooked by those who discuss it. So what did we know? The promises that were made? The First Nations promised to share the land and to be friends and allies with the British at Niagara, the British promised they would always be able to continue their way of life, and they promised to protect them against the phrase they used, where they would protect them against molestation by settlers, because they planned on sending a lot of settlers here. The Crown would sort of be their police service and protect them. So the first real big test, there were annual treaty gatherings, as there still are, to remind the parties one another of what they had promised. But the first real test of the treaty came only about 40 years later, when Canada was invaded by our neighbors to the south, who no longer wanted to be a colony of Great Britain and decided that they wanted Canada to be part of what they were becoming, which was the United States. And history records some great Canadian heroes. There were I have a coin that my grandfather gave me identifying Sir Isaac Brock as the hero of Upper Canada because of his exploits in the War of 1812, which repelled the American invasion. And that's how I grew up, thinking that this man named Sir Isaac Brock, who was a general and who also was the leading political figure in what was then Upper Canada, I grew up believing that he had been the person who largely responsible for fending off this great American invasion of 30 or 40,000, an army of 40 or 5,000 people. But what I now know is that not only did Sir Isaac Brock lose his life fairly early in the war at Queenston Heights near Niagara, where this huge monument, 180-foot tall monument is to him, but that most of Canada's defense force in the War of 1812 were First Nation warriors. You may have heard names like Tecumseh, who was responsible for riding around the United States, convincing different tribes of the importance of them banding together to form a confederacy against, what he saw coming as some of the hazards of colonialism, always wanting more land, spreading westward as came to be. And he met early with Sir Isaac Brock at Fort Malden in southwestern Ontario, and agreed to pledge his confederacy to join with that of the British to defend Canada against the invasion. Now, at this time, there were fewer than 1,500 British soldiers west of Montreal. Most of the War of 1812 battles were fought in what we now know as Ontario. It's the only war ever fought on Canadian soil. And its defense force were First Nations, were Indians. Most of the British army, that mighty army and navy, were back in Europe fighting France again, fighting Napoleon. And even the most biased historian might reluctantly admit that if it weren't for that Indigenous contingent, those 10,000 warriors, that Canada would not look like it does today, and the very good likelihood we'd be part of the United States, which is a kind of a disturbing thought given what the world is like today. And I always challenge teachers. You know the names of Tecumseh, who also died. He didn't die as early in the war as Sir Isaac Brock, but he died and he was killed the following year near Moravian Town in southwest Ontario before the war was over. But I asked them, ask your students, have they ever heard of people like Pakinawalik, Siganak, Meskwaki, Oshawanu, Shawandas? You know, these are great heroes in this country's history. Their contributions to Canada's defense in the War of 1812 is just incredible. But we don't have monuments built like they do to Sir Isaac Brock, even little ones, let alone 180-foot tall ones. So this is an opportunity for teachers. There are many really positive, uplifting, dynamic stories to tell about Canadian history, and this is one of them. Is that role that Indigenous peoples played, and they played that role because they had promised to in the Treaty of Niagara. They were defending their lands. So we have to remember that. And there's a cartoon that unpleasantly shows that while Canadians and Americans often debate who won and who lost the War of 1812, it's safe to say that what we call Canada were the winners, because we didn't lose any of our territories. But over on the side, you see the Indigenous person saying we lost, because it was Indigenous peoples that played the biggest role. They suffered the most casualties, and that impacted on them after, as I said earlier, after the great influx of settlers started to come in, now that the war was over and it was safe. So by the middle of the 1800s, there were estimated to be over 1 million people populating what's now called Ontario. And what did the First Nations people get back? What did the Indigenous peoples get in return for, and remember all the promises that were made? Well, this is, you saw that slide earlier showing that there wasn't 1 square centimeter of land that was not Indigenous occupied. Those little teeny little red dots, primarily south of Nunavut, represent about 600 First Nation reserves, where First Nations people were sort of forced to go, because sometimes under threat, and with promises that if they did that, they would at least get some government sustenance, like food. Remember the buffalo, in which the Plains Indians had survived for food and shelter and so many other things, almost eliminated, and much of that was intentional by colonial authorities. Another way of persuading the Indians to give up their territories. So just so you know, that those little red dots represent 0.2% of Canadian land, Canada's land base, and together those 600 reserves occupy less land than the Great Navajo Reservation in the United States. You can see the attitude that Canada's first leader had about treaties, that his priority was to just extinguish the Indian titles, in this case in Saskatchewan, open it for settlement, take the land and start giving it to settlers. And without any real compensation in any way, they might make a treaty that promised farm implements or things like that. They made big promises, as we said earlier, for that now we understand have significant value, like education, like healthcare, but the governments have chosen not to interpret it in as with the generosity that it was originally intended. And again, this is a kind of a poignant statement from a Mississauga chief, saying that the British came, they just landed up on the shores. They were pitiful, starving in some cases. They didn't know, where to get food, how to build shelter, how to travel. And this chief said, "We nursed you, we protected you, and then when you became a mighty tree, you used your branches to lash us." And again, history is replete with what happened. The Indian Act, which it basically sounds like the doctrine of discovery that Indigenous peoples aren't persons. Indigenous people, to vote in Canada, you have to be a person. Women got that right about 1930 or a bit earlier. Indigenous peoples didn't get that right till 1960, so we weren't people till 1960. The Indian Act is regarded, by the way, as the only piece of racist legislation in place anywhere in the world. Yeah, it's still in place, virtually unchanged since 1876. Among the provisions of it is if you wanted to leave your reserve, you had to get the permission of the Indian agent, many of whom abused their privilege. I know my community, Alderville, has currently got a land claim because the Indian agent of the 1800s managed to talk his way into a few hundred acres of property, which was against, by the way, the Royal Proclamation. Sir William Johnson, by the way, while the terms of the Royal Proclamation that he was preaching to those nations at Niagara, one of the provisions was that no individual settler has a legal right to negotiate with land from the Indians. Sir William Johnson, meanwhile, had accumulated 40,000 acres on his estate in Upper New York State. So he definitely wasn't practicing what he was preaching. And of course, the Indian Act made cultural activities illegal. There were many occasions where Indigenous peoples who, in doing things like are done at powwows now, dancing or singing, usually spiritual songs or dances, went to jail. Went to jail for singing, went to jail for dancing, went to jail for worshiping, in effect. And of course, the ultimate in promise breaking was to kidnap Indigenous kids. The forceful removal of people from an identified group, is qualifies residential schools as genocide, not cultural genocide, genocide, as was described by the United Nations in 1948. Virtually no Indigenous family in Canada, including my own, was exempt from that practice. 150,000 Native kids were forced to go to these schools. Not all of the stories are as horrific as others, but there was enough to go around. And I guess the frightening statistic that tells it all is that at least 6,000 of those children died at the schools. In some cases, their parents were never even notified, never knew where they were. They don't know where they were buried or if they were buried. And that's death of 6,000 out of that number of students means that statistically, it was more dangerous to be a student at an Indian residential school than to be a Canadian soldier in World War II. A terrifying statistic. So again, this isn't the fault of anybody who's listening to me, but you have to understand that this is part of Canada's history, and it's at last being taught. And this is, I guess, the ultimate example of a broken, violated treaty relationship. Is which started as a relationship between equals and ended up being just the most horrific, abusive type of behavior that any worse than occurred with most European countries. So again, the handshake image, and the current Prime Minister says we will fully implement the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which among which is a renewal, calling for the renewal of the treaty relationship. All this at a time when people trying to exercise their treaty rights, fishing for lobster in the maritime provinces are being beaten. Their boats are being burned. Their buildings are being burned. So it's important that as we come close to Remembrance Day, that we remember other things. In particular, remember the people who have done as much or more to defend Canada as anybody else. And in First Nations people volunteered for military service higher than any other recognized group in the two global wars of the 20th century. Two of the most decorated Canadian war heroes, Corporal Francis Pegamagabo from Wasauksing First Nation near Parry Sound. When he came home, he became chief of his community. He was a sniper. He's one of the few people in history to be given the military medal for bravery in action 3 times. Sergeant Tommy Prince from Broken Head Indian Reserve in Manitoba, one of the most decorated Canadian soldiers in World War II and the Korean War. And again, Tecumseh, I use his photo here because I don't have photos of those other leaders I mentioned to you, or images, I should say, not photos, of Pequenawadik or Shawundas, who is from my community, Alderville, Siganak, Meskwaki, Ashawanu. We have kept our promises, our treaty promises. We have shared in the most profound ways. The National Aboriginal Veterans Monument at Ottawa, National Aboriginal Veterans Day is actually a week from today, before official Remembrance Day. And again, that sacrifice is remembered by First Nations people. That's my community, Alderville First Nation, and a cenotaph that was built almost 100 years ago. It bears the name of everybody who has fought for Canada. I have 3 uncles' names and my grandfather's name on plaques carved into that monument. My grandfather was too old for military service, but started a military band that helped support the war effort. At the time of the First World War, there were only 63 adult men living in Alderville. 38 of them volunteered for military service. There are other communities like Scugog First Nation near Oshawa, where every adult male volunteered for military service. That's keeping your treaty promises in a big way. The wampum belts, I've been asked to share them, to show them to people. These are 2 young teachers from Southern Ontario. I don't remember their names. You can see those 2 Niagara belts, and the one in the middle is the Gaswenta, that dates to about 1613, I think, that talks about the importance of traveling down that river of life in parallel paths, the Indians in their canoe and the newcomers in their boat, not interfering with one another, but sharing and relying on friendship. Treaty, I mentioned that there's still annual treaty days. They have evolved from quite a bit. They are now almost token events. In treaty payments, which at one point were kind of substantial, haven't been adjusted for the, hasn't been any cost of living adjustment. And they look very much the same today. There's always a mounted policeman there. And if for example, the Robinson-Huron Treaty that affects 21 First Nations in the North Shore of Lake Huron, that was supposed to share the wealth as they were starting to find minerals in Northern Ontario. And the corporate interests convinced the government that maybe they should do something to, in the way of a treaty with the Indians. And today, those 21, I'm sorry, at the time that the Robinson-Huron Treaty was implemented in 1850, the beneficiaries of those 21 First Nations got $2 a year. $2 a year was nothing to sneeze at. That amount was doubled to $4 about 15 years later, but it hasn't gone up since then in about 140 years. Despite the fact that in that area, particularly in the Sudbury Basin, they estimate that trillions of dollars have been taken out by companies like Inco, and lumber and minerals and gold and nickel and copper. And so again, there's currently a court case involving the Robinson Huron nations. They had to take Canada to court to get them to keep the promises they made about sharing the wealth from their territory. This picture must be from a Western Canadian treaty, and this lady probably picked up treaty money for some family members because they don't get $5 a year. They only get $4 a year still at Robinson Huron. I always like to remind people that it's important to, many Canadians tend, because they haven't been taught or haven't gone out of their way to learn, that Indigenous peoples, First Nations people, Métis people, Inuit people, we aren't just takers. We've contributed so much in so many ways to Canada, in addition to defending Canada like nobody else during times of peril. And you might not know that Carey Price is a First Nation person from British Columbia, or Leland Bell is a distinguished artist from Manitoulin Island whose work hangs in galleries around the world. Jody Wilson-Raybould rose to the ranks of Justice Minister before she decided that the ethics of federal politics were not something that she could live with. And Dr. Nadine Caron, again, she's a Métis woman from out west who's a surgeon. Many success stories. The handshake image, we are all treaty people. We have to remember that. When I speak to groups, at some point I say, oh, would everybody put up their hand who has treaty rights? And usually it's me, or if there are a couple of other Indigenous peoples who have status cards, they'll put their hand up. But everybody in this country has treaty rights and treaty responsibilities. Your first ultimate responsibility is to make sure that the law, the rule of law in Canada is upheld, and the treaties are the rule of law. They're in Canada's Constitution, the highest law of the land. The right to hunt and fish, not in somebody else's season, but any time that they deem it appropriate, and nobody has understood what's appropriate and understands conservation more than Indigenous peoples. The Mi'kmaq people of the west, of the eastern part of what's now Canada, are being denied their treaty rights that have been backed by the highest law in the land, the Constitution, and endorsed by the Supreme Court of Canada. So that handshake image, we sometimes wonder if it's really amounts to this, that somebody is shaking our hand but crossing their fingers behind them as if it's kids used to do this. It's like they don't have to keep that promise. So we end up with situations like this, a burnt lobster boat. And this Mi'kmaq member of parliament says that politicians only move as far as their voters allow them. So if their voters don't understand what treaty rights are, and think that somehow these old treaties are ancient, nobody has to pay any attention to them, and don't know that they're backed by the Constitution and the Supreme Court, it's up to those governments to move and to take action to make sure that the rule of the law is upheld. The statement on the left was made by Queen Elizabeth, the symbolic representative of the Crown, the Canadian state, in which she talks about her great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, who understood that the foundation of the rights of First Nations peoples are reflected in treaties. And again, the Constitution Act of Canada, on the right of Canada's coat of arms, shows Section 35 that says that's the highest law of the land. So I thank you for listening. I hope that you might have some questions that I can answer, and I just ask you to remember that that we believe that those treaties are symbolized in this teaching that talks about the importance of having respect and honesty and sharing and strength. That we believe that if Canada wants to start exhibiting those virtues, then there's no better place to start than by honoring the treaty promises that they've made. Miigwech, thank you, Nyawa, thanks so much.
Mm. Yeah, well, that was awesome, Morris. Um, Thank you. We do have a couple of questions that came up, and I wanted to share one. Um, well, here's one right here from Grace, actually. She just said that such great information, valuable info that we Indigenous folks don't know. Why is all of the info was and not what as current history taught as per conquest by of? And I think that that's, one of the reasons why we're doing more of this right now, sharing outside of the actual education system. And you and I, Morris, had a quick conversation before we started this morning, and just talking about the importance of the TRC and their calls to action, and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and their calls for justice, and then all of the other mandates and I guess like just agreements put in place to really help move in urban Indigenous people forward and the community forward. So thank you for acknowledging that, Grace. That in the schools right now, like Maura said at the very beginning, we're sharing this information, right? This is the first, like you said, generation in time that kids are being shared information about Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples and original people of Canada from like kindergarten, so right up to grade 12. So it's time right now for our community members and parents and like these platforms. That's what's so wonderful about this.
Yeah,
Did
well,
you want to
first
say anything to
I
that,
want
Morris?
to say Annie Beaujeau to Grace. She's a friend of mine, and she's a school trustee in a board near Sudbury, the Rainbow Board, I think it is. And she has knowledge and experience about things like residential schools. She kept her language. She's a great role model, and I thank her for listening. And she's one of the people that is a great wealth in her community. And it's not just non-Indigenous peoples that don't know as much as we'd like everybody to know about things like treaties, because again, they went to the same schools and had the same education systems, which is starting to change. Our own schools are starting to develop with our own curriculum. And but yeah, the issue she raises, I think, one of the great not the great, one of the common fallacies of teaching Indigenous topics is putting them in the past, is talking about them as if they're somehow ancient history, and that's why it's easier for some people to say, okay, that's over, now let's move on. But these treaties not only were they promised to last and as long as the sun shines, but they have been affirmed by such contemporary legislation as 1982 Constitution Act, by Supreme Court decisions in the case of the Mi'kmaq as recently as 1999. So this isn't ancient history by anybody's measure. And again, the reason I like to I like to talk about some of our current role models, no matter what their age, is that shows we're still here. We have the resilience that many people have shown who were in residential schools is unbelievable. It shows the strength on that teaching that I shared. And there are many things that I encourage teachers. There are many myths. That all these things are part of ancient history instead of contemporary. Still in place. There's still current impacts on socioeconomic impacts on Indigenous peoples that relate directly to the treaties, the failure to implement treaties. And another one is that all Indigenous peoples are the same. Of course, we're not. The people in the tribes, the nations in British Columbia are significantly different in many ways from those in other parts of Canada, for example. And but we're just starting to see that understanding coming into classrooms, and teachers are doing a pretty good job. It's pretty overwhelming because being asked to teach something that you weren't taught yourself can be pretty challenging. But there are all sorts of, we encourage them. There are all sorts of resource people out there. There are still 80,000 residential school survivors. Those are great resource people. Instead of trying to teach about residential schools, I encourage teachers, try to find someone who is comfortable talking to young children about the experience of being taken away from your parents. It doesn't have to be a horror story. Just being taken. A friend of mine named Jack Smallboy, who is a great artist, went to a residential school in Moosonee, and he tells the story of what it's like when you're 7 or 8 years old. For the first 3 or 4 months, you're in a strange place away from your family, not being even called by your name, but being called number 14. I mean, that's a horrible way to treat kids. It's systemic child abuse. So, but again, there are good stories. There are stories about what people have achieved. People like Basil Johnson, who wrote, I think, 14 or 15 books, and who didn't have the courage until he'd been married for over 40 years to tell his wife of some of his experiences in residential school. But the resilience that he showed and what he has given to Canada, I think people need to hear those stories, and understand that how much better this country could be if everybody is treated like we're all related, like those medicine wheel teachings say. Everybody has something to contribute to Canada, and we're now seeing challenges in some urban centers, particularly about the impacts of any kind of discrimination on any people of different color on that medicine wheel. But thanks, Grace, for giving me that opportunity to talk about some of those stereotypes.
Awesome. Also, Wendy mentioned too. She had mentioned the pipeline and asked what your thoughts are on the pipeline.
Yeah, and that's an excellent question, and it's these things get very complicated because, in general, I think it's safe to say that most people in Canada think that carbon-based use of carbon-based products, whether it's oil or gas, but that's just, we've got to find a way out of that because it's causing so much damage to our planet, not just in the extraction process, but the emissions they're killing our planet. And some First Nations people in British Columbia, for example, they've been excluded from the economy, so their elected leaders want them to have jobs related to that industry, and traditional people just don't want any part of that. That the traditional hereditary leaders. So again, there's no unanimity among First Nations people any more than there is among any other segment of society. But the important thing is to start dialogues and to start looking for ways to move into a carbonless society. And there are ways to do that. And there are other places in the world where they have started that process. I think sometimes the media likes to seize on what looks like differences of opinion and make that the story instead of ways to move ahead that benefit everybody.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We also had Wendy made a comment about the when you were talking about the Indian Act and said, would the act be invalid if the word Indian is changed? And,
that it's interesting that most people I've heard that get very upset about that word tend to be non-Indigenous peoples. If you go out west, they're very proud of that word. Mm-hmm. And I know many elders who, when they want to speak their language, they say, "I'm going to talk Indian now."
Yeah.
It's only since we've had an influx of people from South Asia that it gets kind of confusing. And again, that is the stereotype is what contributes to the baggage associated with that word. I was taught in school that Christopher Columbus was looking for India, so he washed up on the shores of somewhere in the Caribbean, maybe the Bahamas, and he sees these brown-skinned people, so he figures he's in India, so he says, "I'm going to call these people Indians." We have a little joke. We like to say we're glad he wasn't looking for turkey. But there's another version to that story that's much nicer, in that he records in his journal that these people were so at one with their natural surroundings that they were in Dios. That means they were with God. How come that story wasn't taught in school? The word Indian wouldn't be nearly as as negatively stereotyped. If that story had been, everybody would have wanted to be called an Indian if that had have been the story we were told. So, but thank you, Wendy, for the question.
That's funny. And then we had another question from Leonard about what First Nations people eat. I was going to answer that myself, but I just thought I'd let you go
What do we
ahead
eat?
with that one. Yeah, what do the First Nations people eat?
Well, I know people that try to stick to traditional diets, which is very, very hard. And it's been processed, the influx of convenient processed foods have really caused a lot of health issues among Indigenous peoples, because you can't change, even in centuries, you can't change someone's genetic makeup. So when you go from a diet of of wild game and plants, all of a sudden you're eating things out of cans that are full of preservatives. That's brought epidemics of things like diabetes and whatnot. And that's, I know I try to eat as healthy as I can, and my doctor calls me pre-diabetic because I have genetic predisposition. I worked at the Union of Ontario Indians for 14 years. Out of, I think, 60 employees, I think something like 40 of them were diabetic. Again, we're eating the same food that other society members are eating, but maybe it causes more damage to us because it's so foreign to what we used to eat. I do know that traditional people, people who try their best to keep their traditions, say that, and this isn't they don't say it in a racial way, but they say be careful of the whites: sugar, flour, milk. I can never remember the fourth. but those are but those are not, certainly in excess. And everybody, I was watching a program on television last night in which they were talking about sugar addiction. So those have not really been helpful to our people, or I suspect anybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly what it is, right? But I think I was getting feedback. So is it okay on your end right now?
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I'm going to thank you, but I took a couple of notes along the way because I actually was laughing a lot during your presentation, and I love it. Makes it light. And then there was times where I had to light a little bit of medicine because it's heavy.
Yeah.
And but there was a part in it that even this morning when I woke up, just thinking about my day and how I guess fortunate I am to have spent this time with you, or I knew I was going to. I was thinking about the wind because it's been really windy the last couple of days, and just the teachings that we share about what happens when the wind comes in, and it's the time for clearing and messaging and a lot of things like that. And then there was the one part of your presentation that you said you came as the wind blew across. Mm-hmm. And the wind wafted you to our shores. And I love that because it's such an Indigenous way, to say something. And I love the humility of our culture. And that is so important, when we're delivering information that's hard for people to hear. And it's heavy information. But I was creeping you a little bit to check out what you've done in your past, and I love to do that with the people that we bring forward. So I wanted to go back to 2015 when you had there's an article in the Anishinaabe News that's published by the Communications Unit of the Union of Ontario Indians, I guess, if that's said properly. And you started with, you can't learn if you don't listen. Mm-hmm. And there's a story about how after the dust cleared at the 1876 Battle of the Little Bighorn, is it Cheyenne? And Lakota Cheyenne, yes, thank you. And Lakota women scouring the battlefield for spoils of war came across the body of legendary Indian killer George Armstrong Custer. They reached down and pierced Custer's ears with needles, saying, "You didn't hear us in this life. Maybe you will in the next." A harsh lesson, to be sure, but one that resonates for Indigenous people who still have trouble getting to people to listen to what they have to say. It's worse than simply disagreeing with Indigenous versions of history. It's the outright refusal to acknowledge that there is an Indigenous version. And, you know, I thought that was really powerful. And, you know, Maurice, do you think that like the change, like since you had that message, you know, 5 years ago, and, you know, speaking today with the treaties and, you know, you called this talk treaties, a Canadian hypocrisy.
Mhm.
And, you know, are we like, where are we from where you talked about?
Well, and yeah, I should have mentioned the title. I called Treaties a Canadian hypocrisy. Hypocrisy, of course, to be a hypocrite is to say one thing and not back it up with action, or that can involve lying or deception. Or, and I should tell you that there was one principle in one group of people I was talking to that questioned the use of that. They thought that was a bit harsh. Um, my definition of harsh is living in a community where you've had to boil your water for 26 years. That's my idea of harsh. Um, and I guess I've seen a lot of change. And one of the there are some advantages in getting older. One of them is that you see things in greater perspective. And I've had a number of people. I try not to dwell on a lot of negative things about the past, because I want people to learn about them, and I want people to start looking into what residential schools were like. It's not my place as a non-survivor to do that, but I can make people hopefully curious enough to want to learn more, about treaties. But I also believe that we should talk about all of the things that Indigenous peoples have accomplished and continue to accomplish. And I was asked at one of my sessions last week, online sessions, how could I have any optimism given all the negative stuff in the past? Well, I don't dwell on the past. I don't forget it, but I don't dwell on it. That we're supposed to use history to inform us to make a better present and future. But you have to understand where you've been before you can really know where you're going. Um, and um, and I said to this person, you know, this event that we have online today, this was sponsored by the provincial government. This is a government that 25 years ago bears some responsibility in the death of Dudley George. That's not very long ago, and this kind of event, as I said to all these, I had an audience of civil servants. I said, I can't imagine this being staged by a government 10 years ago. I can't imagine it happening. So you have to be on the agenda before things happen. And I think Indigenous peoples are on the agenda. And I think you don't have to go back too far to hear politicians or judges or lawyers saying things that they were downright racist. You still do. There's a senator I could think of who named Lynn Bayak, who's kind of out there. She thinks residential schools were a necessary thing, a good thing. She still got her job. She's still making a lot of money, despite those views. But once you're on the agenda and people are starting to pay attention, and the biggest thing is to get in the education system, because that's where the intelligence, the minds, the understandings, the philosophies of the people who are going to be prime ministers, who are going to be judges, who are going to be journalists, that's where they learn about what Canada has been and what they want it to be. So I think the biggest positive change is what Ontario and other provinces have done in their education about telling more complete histories and contemporary issues, Indigenous authors being used in the schools, as well as immigrant authors, because we have to remember that almost half of people that live in Canada now have come from different cultures. So we're all on that medicine wheel. We're all related, and I think that Canada is a very young country, but I think we're still in our teenage years. But I think that we're growing up pretty well. Senator Murray Sinclair says it took 500 years for things to get that bad. They're not going to immediately turn around in a decade. but I think we're moving in the right direction, and opportunities like this are much appreciated. And again, I don't profess to. I'm very biased in my opinions, but other people have had their turn to be biased for 150 years, so we should have a little chance too.
I love it. I love it. And I actually love that, you know, Murray Sinclair said that, but I also love that our youth actually, they think quicker. Like, we can get this done fast. We can get this into action. So I'm really excited on that note to say that this week, we're still figuring out the exact day and time, but we'll be having our Grandmother's Voice Indigenous youth, what do you call them? I guess like our ambassadors, you could say, and they'll be speaking to the treaties and the importance of the young people understanding what they were, how we bring them, you know, forward, speak about them being current, and really, really grateful, Maurice. You're really awesome to speak with, and we're really excited to you know, to bring you in and for you accepting to kind of do more work with us. We're doing some work with some community members, and really important work, because the front line, you know, community needs our support right now, and our Halton police have been really gracious with wanting to move forward and making space for our Indigenous community here in Halton, and we're really happy to share all of that with you when the time comes, and share you with them. And so, Nyolan Goa, for your time and your knowledge and your essence and everything that you offer. Again, thank you. Thank you so much.
If I can I just add one thing before I go? Is it tomorrow that you're having a youth group and Dakota Brandt is involved?
Well, actually, Dakota's quite busy because she has her new jewelry, or her jewelry line happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we haven't really been able to connect with her, but we will have Makasha Looking Horse, and we have a few another youth from We Matter, and then a youth from our community here in Halton, an Indigenous urban youth. So yeah,
excuse me, the next time you happen to be speaking to Dakota, just ask her if she remembers me, because when she was a young undergraduate at Trent University, I was speaking there on an annual elders meeting, and I gave her, she was so impassioned about her culture, and she was talking about treaty, and this is a number of years, it has to be 10 years ago. I had with me a little version of the Geswenta, the Tuara Wampum, and I gave it to her. And I hope she still carries it and looks after it, and that it's influenced her. So,
you know what, I will. I'm gonna reach out to her again now and mention that, and maybe she'll say, "Hey, I can find an hour to come and sit and show that belt." That would be wonderful. Okay. Wendy shared, super humbled by Maurice's knowledge and wonderful presentation. So, well, all right.
Thanks so much again, Jody. You know, I appreciate the opportunity, and glad to support, you know, any initiative that creates more awareness about First Nations. We're all trying to make Canada the best country it can be. So,
we are.
So Skana.
Skana.